Hello, and welcome, one and all, as I tried to catch my breath there, to the Games Monster podcast from Extreme Improv Extremed. Remember, guys, always stay extremed. If you haven't done so already, smash that subscribe button over on youtube.com/Extreme Improv, or click subscribe on whichever platform you are watching or listening on, because we're available on all of the big podcast platforms: Apple, Spotify, Google, Alexa, the lot. So, with this, welcome to the Games Monster podcast. On today's show, I'll be discussing the recent leak of the Goldeneye 007 game, created by Rareware for the Nintendo 64 originally, but then this HD remaster, which was intended to come out on the Xbox 360, but never got revealed to the public and never actually got released at all. Well, obviously, if it wasn't revealed to the public, but it wasn't cancelled when people felt like, oh, this is coming out. There was always been rumours of it, but there was never ever any concrete evidence that this thing ever intended to release, which obviously it did if they if a full copy of the game is leaked online. So just very quickly, if you don't know what the game I'm talking about, in 1997, I believe it was, Rareware was a second-party developer for Nintendo, and they created some of the biggest games and some of the biggest games on the Super Nintendo and N64 for Nintendo, including like the Donkey Kong Country trilogy, Diddy Kong Racing, Killer Instinct, Blast Corps, and so on and so forth. But like, one of their biggest games, or perhaps their most famous game, up there with Donkey Kong Country, is Goldeneye. In 1995, there was the movie of Goldeneye that came out, and Nintendo got the rights to it, which is kind of weird when you think back to it now. I can't actually think of another time when Nintendo specifically got the rights to a big license like that, a movie license. I think in years since, they're just more focused on like their own IP, and obviously this is an example of they had this big game under their banner, and now years later it's an Xbox game which can't then get released, and doesn't get released until it gets leaked out so many years later. And originally Goldeneye was going to be a Super Nintendo game, probably somewhat with the graphical style, and when I say graphical style I just mean like the CGI rendered style that they use for Killer Instinct and Donkey Kong Country. But then along the way it got moved to the N64, and I won't go into the whole history of the production of the game, just because, one, I wouldn't do it justice, and two, we can save that for later on when I've done a bit more research. But the game started off as it was going to be a on-rail shooter like House of the Dead or Virtua Cop, and eventually it became a first-person shooter. At the time, I guess they were probably looking at things like Doom and Quake and Hexen and Duke Nukem and stuff like this, but they made it, because of the James Bond theme and James Bond license, much more stealthy, and they really were the first company to nail a first-person shooter on a console, because people would say about, well, keyboard and mouse, but this showed that first-person shooters could work on a console. And we'll get into how it works or doesn't work, or historically how well it worked. But at the time, at least, it really worked. They'd got a mechanic which you kind of see in Resident Evil games, where if you want to do specific aiming, you can press a button, but then you can't actually move and aim at the same time. And that's only for very, very specific aiming. You can aim anywhere other points in the game. And I think there's even a little bit of like an aim assist on there, just because obviously the N64 only had one analog stick. It was the first console that came with an analog stick as a standard, or at least there may have been one, like an Atari one or something back in the early 1980s, but this was the first time where it became like a big thing, and from this point onwards, every console that got released would come with a analog stick. And so one analog stick doesn't give you the standard twin stick dual analog stick controls that we get in all first-person shooters and most games nowadays, where the left stick will move your character to some degree, the right stick will control the camera. And the game was great. It was because it was very unlike Doom and Quake and these things, it was much more based on stealth, on completing missions. In this sense, it was probably inspired by Super Mario 64, where you'd go around levels and you'd have specific tasks you had to complete in order to finish a level. Just like on Super Mario 64, you might have to collect 8 red coins, or you might have to collect a star, or you might have to win a race, or whatever. They'd give like different challenges in order to complete a level. Goldeneye did the same. It wasn't just like Doom, where it was like collect a bunch of keys and then escape. It might be that you have to use a computer. It might be that you have to blow up some like big containers. I can't even remember what they are. It's the first level of the game, but anyway. Oh no, second level. But it was revolutionary, and at the same time, it was just before we got the release. When I say just before, a year, or a few months or a year or whatever it was before we got Metal Gear Solid, and the two of those combined meant that stealth became a huge thing in gaming, and it still is to this day. You know, so many games would have stealth sections, but now it's more fully integrated into so many games that we get. So anyway, it was a huge hit. I think it was the second highest selling game for the N64 after Super Mario 64, and it was the one where it was the multiplayer game. Everyone would sit round, 4 controllers, split screen deathmatch mode, and the funny trivia here is that the multiplayer game was a last minute addition, and yet it was then received so well. And amazingly, this is where I said about like Nintendo didn't, perhaps were ones that blocked this later on, which I'll get to in a second, but Nintendo and Rareware had the opportunity to make the next James Bond game, Tomorrow Never Dies, and Rare ridiculously wanted to make their own IP, which was then Perfect Dark, which was a sequel, spiritual sequel in gameplay and presentation and everything, but just not in name or James Bond license. It didn't do as well. It came out later on the N64's lifespan, and perhaps people already moving on from the N64. But that was definitely a mistake. If I point to something that was a mistake, they could have made 2 games. They could have made Perfect Dark, and they could have made Tomorrow Never Dies. And if they were smart, then, even though game development was different then, and the Rareware team's always been perhaps a slightly smaller team, but just by increasing the amount of team, knowing that, well, we need to pump these out every year, they could have gone with the pattern of Goldeneye, then Perfect Dark, then Tomorrow Never Dies, then Perfect Dark 2, then The World Is Not Enough. And they could have done this thing like how Midway or whatever it is, Warner Games, whoever's got the rights to Mortal Kombat these days, will put out Mortal Kombat, then it'll put out like Injustice, then Mortal Kombat, then Injustice. And how you get the different Call of Duty teams who will be like Black Ops 3, then Modern Warfare, then Black Ops 4, then Modern Warfare 2, or whatever it is. And they could have gone for that approach where they say, well, it's the same great gameplay, and it's not being the James Bond license allows us to do some things that you can't do in James Bond. But because we know you like James Bond, here's James Bond. And then everyone the next year would be like, well, we don't want to miss the party just by sticking with James Bond. And then you'd be building up Perfect Dark as well. But obviously Rareware didn't put out games every year. It took them after 1997, I think, until 2000 to put out Perfect Dark. So that's a little bit down to their own being perfectionists, and Nintendo being perfectionists probably meant that something like that wasn't viable, as at the same time, in the same era, Crash Bandicoot 1, 2, 3, followed by Crash Team Racing, followed by Crash Bash, were 5 games which came out within 5 years. So anyway, it was at the time, and still to this day, probably seen as the most successful movie license game that's ever been released. And now it's been a very long time since it was released. Like I said, a Sony exclusive. I'm not sure who made it. It might have been EA, but whoever had the rights to James Bond next made Tomorrow Never Dies. And people were like, yeah, James Bond now on PlayStation exclusive. And that definitely hurt Nintendo. But people are like, oh, this game sucks. And people don't remember Tomorrow Never Dies very well. And then, of course, after that, we got The World Is Not Enough, which came out on PlayStation and N64, and may have come out on other things as well. I don't know, that it was on the Dreamcast. But they were like, yeah, well, this is good. It's still not as good as Goldeneye, but it's better than Tomorrow Never Dies. And then after that, we kind of moved away specifically from the movie tie-ins, just to be like Agent Under Fire, and then another one, which I can't remember, which was like GameCube era. And they were trying to be like Goldeneye, and then they actually did release a new Goldeneye game, which was unrelated to the movie in any way. And then eventually they did a remake of Goldeneye, and this is going to be super important to the story here. The remake of Goldeneye debuted on the Wii, and I don't think Nintendo actually had the rights to this in any way. It was Activision or whoever. And they obviously thought, like, right, if we put this out as a Wii exclusive to begin with, because obviously the Wii wasn't in the same category of power compared to the Xbox 360 and the PS3. By putting it out on the Wii first, it meant that everyone would be like, oh yes, GoldenEye remake on Nintendo, rather than people feeling the same suspicion over it that they did with like Tomorrow Never Dies and things. A James Bond game coming out on a non-Nintendo system was just seen as, oh, they're trying to capitalise on GoldenEye. But this being a GoldenEye remake on a Nintendo machine, people were like very open to it. And it's interesting just that there were ways in which they paid tribute to the original game. Not that I can remember it that well, but it wasn't in any way actually connected to Rareware or I think Nintendo. I don't think there was any rights to it. It was just that it was both based on the movie. They updated James Bond from being Pierce Brosnan to being Daniel Craig. And yeah, people were like, yeah, this is good. It's not great, but did it affect the legacy of the original one? No, it just meant that people wanted the original one more. But this brings us to this era. I think that game came out in 2010, the Wii game, and then a year later it came out as GoldenEye Reloaded for the PS3 and for the Xbox 360, probably just to capitalise on that we can make more money out of this game we've already built just by giving it HD upgrades on the graphics. But perhaps it didn't do as well as they'd hoped, because perhaps it wasn't as good a game and it wasn't the GoldenEye that people wanted. Now, this is where it gets interesting, because in this same era, Rareware were putting out their re-releases from the N64 onto the Xbox 360, because in 2001 or 2002, Rareware were bought, it was 2002, Rareware were bought by Microsoft and were now making games exclusively for the Xbox 360. They put out games such as Grab by the Ghoulies and Conquer Live and Reloaded, and that itself was a remake of an N64 game, Conquer's Bad Fur Day. But the game that people really wanted was like GoldenEye, Perfect Dark, and of course there was going to be Perfect Dark Zero as an Xbox 360 launch title. Those two games I mentioned were original Xbox games, and so it was like, right, we're back to Perfect Dark with Perfect Dark Zero, and then it was like, right, we're going to put out the original Perfect Dark on the Xbox Live Arcade, and we'll put out Banjo-Kazooie and Banjo-Tooie on Xbox Live Arcade, and they all came out with prettier HD graphics, and they were well received. But people were like, oh, what about GoldenEye? And it never emerged. There were rumours of it, and these rumours were founded, but it never emerged. There was never any announcements, never any screenshots. But now, as we know the story that we can fill in the blanks, the game was made. It was intended for release. And incredibly, it seemed like they felt they had the rights, but if a new interview that's just come out this week is to be believed, someone who could just say no to it said no. And it would seem like it was someone from Nintendo who was just like, a Nintendo game's not coming out for Xbox. And everyone else who was in Nintendo seemed to say yes. And I don't know, it's interesting, I don't know how Nintendo were able to stop this, because again, just as the discussion's been all about this within the last few days, I don't know how Nintendo were able to stop it, because if Nintendo didn't still have the rights to James Bond, then what's it to do with them? Because obviously they sold Rare to Microsoft, so anything that Rare developed, like Banjo-Kazooie. I'm sure that had massive amounts of funding and input from Nintendo. That went over to Microsoft. I don't know why they wouldn't have worked out, if we eventually tried to re-release Goldeneye, why that wasn't part of the discussions when Microsoft bought Rare. Now, obviously at the time, EA or Sony or whoever had the rights to James Bond, but you'd have thought they would have sorted out that element of the deal with Nintendo, just to know, well, who owns this game. And now, obviously, they owned the in-game designs because they were able to reuse some of them in Perfect Dark, and then they were able to re-release Perfect Dark. And perhaps, just like, it was a complete nightmare, perhaps between Microsoft, who owned Rare, who created and developed Goldeneye, and Nintendo, who are the ones who originally got the rights to Goldeneye so that it could be made into that specific game, and then Sony, who I think had some rights to the James Bond license in terms of movies or something at the time. It just meant that everyone, and maybe EA had a stake in it as well, everyone had a stake in it, but it just feels like it would have been a super easy money maker, and it felt like this should have been the thing. Never mind Minecraft years later coming out on everything, despite the fact that Microsoft bought Mojang. It should have been Goldeneye, where it's been like, look, everyone wants this game. Now, the fact that Wii wasn't HD perhaps was something that could have prevented this happened. If the Wii U had been out, and the Xbox 360 and the PS3 at this specific moment in time, and there could have been parity between all three versions, whereas the Wii re-release of the N64 GoldenEye for the Virtual Console wouldn't have been able to produce the HD remaster graphics which are on this version that's leaked out. But if they'd waited until the Wii U, then perhaps they could have been like, right, GoldenEye is coming out for the Xbox 360 because Microsoft own Rare, who developed it. It's coming out for the Wii U because Nintendo was the original home of GoldenEye, and that's what people associate it to. And it's also coming out on PlayStation, and that's because Sony in some way had the rights to the James Bond license. And it could have been this historic thing, and it'll be on all of these things, and it'll be published by EA, who may have also had the rights, and EA might, or Activision, whoever was part of the equation. You just do some deal, make it happen. No one makes the full amount of money, but everyone makes some money. Gamers are then happy, and people won't be begging for years for something that never emerges. But the fact of the matter is, it didn't happen. GoldenEye Remastered didn't come out during the Xbox 360 era on any platform, let alone the Xbox. And that brings us forward to 2021. And well, very quickly along the way, there was some footage of this game released, I think in 2016, something had leaked out. But now, eventually, a full playthrough of the game released a week ago, and there was stuff saying that, look, this game is going to come out, be released to the public in 2021 at some point. And then a week later, everyone's got it, everyone's playing it. Apparently 230 million people have downloaded this thing. And I won't talk about where you can get it or how you can play it. Like, it's completely legal to have a Xbox emulator, an Xbox 360 emulator, because emulators are legal. But if you don't have the game, then technically you shouldn't have any of the ROMs because they count as copies. If you do own the original game, then it's seen as a backup, and apparently that therefore is legal. I don't know a whole lot about these, I don't really use them. But I know that ROMs are what they do put onto these micro consoles or whatever, and to some degree, like a virtual console or whatever, these are ROMs, so in this sense everyone uses them to some degree, and a system like the Evercade is built around ROMs, I believe. But anyway, so this leaked out and is fully playable, and the graphics are a huge upgrade. Now clearly this isn't quite the final release, and again, news has come out this week saying that there was one final release which is further along than this, and the game when it starts has got and you can watch a whole playthrough of it, someone did online a week ago. It comes up saying about this is missing a Nintendo logo, and then during the opening credits, after the James Bond shoots the screen and blood comes down the screen, as happens in all the movies, it shows the cast of characters, and it shows them in their N64 graphics, and most, but not quite all, suddenly get upgraded graphics. And it's interesting that not quite all become upgraded, because it just shows that this wasn't quite a finished game. But then when you play the actual game, you can press a button, and with a single button press, it can go from the old graphics from the N64 to the new graphics from the Xbox 360. And it's weird, it's one of these games, like Perfect Dark re-released on the Xbox, where the graphics from the N64 version, in some ways, look better, just because you look at it and it looks like an N64 game. When you see modern textures on something that was an N64 game, then like the world seems very bare. It doesn't feel like there's much populating it, not much scenery. The characters' models look low polygon, but have got better textures, basically. And it's cool to see it like that, but especially on Perfect Dark, and I'll have to go back to Perfect Dark and see how this plays. I hated the Xbox 360 re-release, just because there was some areas where there was like, it was dark and it was like pitch black and I couldn't see what I was meant to be doing. And just thinking about it now, perhaps if I could have switched back to the old graphics, it would have improved things, but that's if you could go back to the old graphics. I haven't played it in 10 years on the 360, so I don't know. Or maybe I had a quick go on Rare Replay, because here's the other thing, Rare Replay, when it came out on the Xbox One, that had all of the like 30 years with 30 Rareware games, it was sorely missing Goldeneye. We knew it wouldn't get Donkey Kong Country, but it was also missing Goldeneye. And if eventually now they can look at it and say, well look, everyone's downloaded it anyway, why don't we do something to remaster it again so that it's got, or like just remake it with these incredible graphics? Wouldn't that be great? Like basically the same game, but with some quality of life improvements. And I'm going to get to the biggest one that's already been done in a second, but just really like how the Resident Evil remake added new things. It was basically the same map, basically the same layout and story structure, but just a few different things here and there. Rare already did it with Conquer Live and Reloaded, except for after 10 minutes they're like, oh, we're not going to change anything anymore, which was ridiculous, because it would have been fun. But they should do this now. They should put out a new version, and it would be amazing if you could press like the button to change from the graphics. So you change from N64 to Xbox 360 to Xbox Series X, and it's 4K and like all of the bells and whistles that you can do with it, ray tracing and all this other shenanigans. So anyway. Let's talk about what the quality of life improvements are. And the main one, as I was alluding to earlier, is the N64 only had one analog stick, whereas the Xbox 360 had two, and the Xbox 360 control is still essentially the same as what they use for the Xbox One and for the Xbox Series X. It is just the same control at this stage. And it means that when you move your character forward, you use the left stick. When you move your character backwards, you use the left stick. And if you want to move your character to sidestep left and right, you press the left stick left or right. Whereas on the original game, forwards and backwards were on the left stick, but then sidestepping left or right were mapped to the CL and CR buttons on the right-hand side of the controller. And then the left and right directions on the analog stick would turn the direction of Bond, and that is super weird to go back to. Like, it's still completely playable, and if you play so many games like Super Mario, well, not even Super Mario, if you play so many things now, it'll be that it's basically the tank controls, not Super Mario at all, that was the wrong example. If you play something like Resident Evil, where you press a button, you press the control stick to the left, and it will rotate your character. And that's what this would do. It would rotate Bond. So it would mean that you wouldn't use just the left stick for the movement of the body, whereas you'd now use the right stick, which there wasn't before, to control the movement of Bond's face. So the right stick will control whether you look up or down, but it will also control whether you look left or right, and with that it will turn his body left or right to turn around. And this is the way that games have been since the late 1990s, but didn't really catch on until the Halo era of games. That was the big one, because even like the Dreamcast only had a single analog stick. And so when they introduced dual stick controls on something like Alien Resurrection on the PS1, at first people were like, whoa, this is super weird, these controls aren't what I'm used to. But now they've become standard. Going back to the N64 style controls feel weird. And even on this re-release here, from the standard settings, you have to go into a menu and choose to invert. Like if you press the right stick up or down to mimic the C up or C down buttons on the N64 pad, you need to invert it, because they have it so that when you press up, you look down, and when you press down, you look up. And I think nowadays you press up and you know that you look up. Having the inverted controls is just weird. Some people, I guess, will always have that's what they're used to. But anyway, so this is still Goldeneye. It does hold up with the new quality of life controlling setup change. The focus on stealth is just interesting, because obviously, like I said about the controller change, the control scheme, you would have it on the old game so that you'd press like the right shoulder button and then you'd be able to do precise aiming, like I mentioned was similar to on Resident Evil. You'd hold down an aim button and then you wouldn't be able to aim and move at the same time. If you wanted to do really precise aiming, this was the best solution for it on the N64, and the enemies you go against are built around this. Being able to do more precise aiming just by using twin sticks, which was achievable back on the N64, I think on the N64 version of GoldenEye, but quite possibly maybe it was just introduced in Perfect Dark, by using two controllers together, two N64 controllers. So you could only ever do two-player game. You couldn't have four players doing that control method. But it wasn't impossible either. So it shows that it was thought of back then, and perhaps that was a sign that Rareware were really ahead of the times. But having this style of... that wasn't standard. Basically, the standard would be you've got one analog stick on one controller. And so it meant the game was designed around having just one analog stick and then a little bit of auto-aim or aim assist on there. And then using this shoulder button method. It means having twin sticks to improve your aiming on this game means that you probably have an easier time playing it based on the modern sensibilities of first-person shooters. So that might actually make the game easier for people who are used to playing it nowadays, playing first-person shooters in the modern era. But anyway, let me know what you think of the game. Are you excited to play it? So, are you downloading it? Are you hoping this will prompt Nintendo, Microsoft, Sony, whoever's got the rights nowadays to put their heads together and finally make an official release out of this? Because I think everyone would still want it. Doesn't matter if 230 million people have downloaded it. It just goes to show how many people are interested in it. And if you were going to say, well, you can play online and there's going to be these other bells and whistles if you buy the game, everyone will be like, oh, I don't want to play this dodgy, pirated copy. I want to play the proper one. And people would go out and buy it in droves. They'd sell gangbusters. I'm not even really sure what that phrase means. But anyway, I'm going to begin to wrap things up there. Let me know if you're excited for this finally seeing release into the world. And you can click the subscribe button on youtube.com/Extreme Improv. It really helps us out. I can't put that over enough. There's going to be so much more content coming up in the days, weeks and months to come. Obviously, Extreme Improv, it has got all of our improv comedy shows, but we're going to have lots more content in the world of movies, video games, pro wrestling, tech, all sorts of stuff's coming up. Shows, interactive stuff, podcasts, reviews. So watch this space, because there's going to be announcements as soon as I can make it happen. I'm just waiting on a couple of tech gremlins to be sorted out to launch some great new stuff. So until next time, stay safe, have a good one, and always stay extreme.